Harry, what's going on, man?
Hey, how are you?
Good. Nice to meet synchronously for the first time, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've had a few interactions in the past, so it's good to connect.
So the idea here is like what I did with Christian was we had a good kind of organic conversation. The idea was, we're both pretty deep in the weeds on doing things with AI for clients and so on and so forth across a bunch of different industries on like a continuous basis.
Yep.
And so we thought it'd be interesting, instead of doing just like a podcast conversation, doing something that's like kind of interactive and seeing where it went. Um, and so that's what we've been going back and forth on, like on the Google Doc and Figma and everything else. So I guess we have I think two. Do we have 2 hours set aside? How much time do we have?
I think it's an hour and a half.
Hour and a half.
Maybe.
Okay, yeah. So we got 90 minutes set aside. Where do you want to get to in 90 minutes? Like,
This this could be a lot. Yeah. I don't know. I do this. I've started doing the same thing where now, whenever I have like streams of thought stuff, I just use Super Whisper and then drop it into Claude and then just like use that workflow. So
yeah,
I was like trying to figure out, all right, from my last conversations, like what would be something that would be interesting to talk about.
yeah,
And I feel like the one like OKRs AI like is so many different, like you can combine the two phrases and then start any kind of conversation, like OKRs for AI for OKRs, or
sure.
some other meta composition. So I'm not even sure where we want to start. I think the most interesting is probably, and the one that's been on my mind is uh, there is so many more developments of better workflows and better outcomes that are driven by AI that either take so much time with from like a human element, or haven't been possible just because of data scattered everywhere, and then people can start to use it better.
Yeah,
Is it actually being effective for what we want to achieve as a business? Right, like our sales team is getting faster,
yeah,
our marketing is reaching more people,
yes.
but at the end of the day, is it actually making the change we want on the business? Like, does it actually matter if our sales team is faster? Um,
I
so
100% agree. And like, it might be helpful if I share some context around like how, I mean, if we both share some context around like how we've personally had these things like merge.
yeah, yeah,
Because for me, it's like they're kind of actually the same thing.
hmm,
Like they totally are like the AI OKR thing is to me like relatively clearly at this point, like it's part of the same unified system.
yeah,
And 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 what's interesting is they are super, I think they're super complementary, but they are like distinct halves of this thing that you have to do to take advantage of these ways of working, the technology, like whatever else in kind of the 21st century. And so the way I got started was I'd been doing the OKR thing for a little while, sort of stumbled into consulting kind of by accident, where I
mm,
shared sort of my variation on the way Christina Wutke does it, which is where I drew like inspiration originally, found it to work pretty well. And personally found it like very energizing and everything else. And now we officially have more AI note takers than
oh
humans.
god, I didn't even know my one was. I
Yeah,
think at one point I had three different tools plugged in, and it was like,
100%.
yeah,
Um, um, but and so I started working with some clients on doing the OKR stuff. After I told a stranger who reached out, yeah, I'd be happy to help you, and they were like, we want to pay you, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. So that was like the beginning of the consulting journey. And in late 2022, had access to GPT-3, brushed off some of the Python chops that I forced myself to pick up like in college, and then also had access to Midjourney, which I was kind of
mm,
experimenting with the previous startup, and just like had this feeling where I was like, I think this is a general purpose technology. I think this is going to be like, maybe the internet or something. Felt like a big deal. And so like proactively was investing more and more time just to like tinkering and figuring out what was possible. And then as I had the OKR clients, one of the things that happens as a function of doing that, like one objective, three key result, make order out of chaos approach to, you know, running the process is you're constantly you constantly are faced with like new problems that you've never solved before, and that the business doesn't have it, you know, necessarily the existing capacity to deal with, but it's clear what needs to happen. So the question is like, okay, are you going to do it yourself? Are you going to hire somebody? And then if it's like a commitment that's, you know, you have to do it by next week or something, you don't have time to do the hiring, right? Or maybe you could hire a computer to do it, you know, at least to help you. And so that forcing function of like, okay, we have to do the new thing, we have to like move the project forward, we have to, you know, whatever. That was enough that it was like it made sense to experiment with it, and it just it actually worked pretty well. Even like GPT-3 worked pretty well for things like creating content for like a mobile app screen, or um, you know, summarizing bits and pieces of qualitative like interviews and so on and so forth. Once GPT-4 was out, I had API access. It was like, in the context of the OKR things, just start plugging it in everything, and it's like, okay, you can go way faster. Certain things you had to hire people for, something new is happening. But the temptation I think people have is to like just try to automate things initially.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, no,
It's
gotta be.
automating. They're trying to automate too much of the wrong things. It's
Yeah,
kind of like the whole. I remember I listened to your or the Dan Montgomery episode that you had with the
yeah,
podcast, because that was a really interesting take of like, there's OKRs, like if we take like the process, right, of like we got to do OKRs or we're doing them, and then you introduce AI, it's like, oh, I can just like, similar to people who are writing blogs, or like, write me a blog about X. They'd see it from GPT-3 and be like, wow, that was really good. Like, I'm going to use that. And they slowly realize like, okay, the quality's not there. It doesn't capture, like, there's a lot more like action that needs to be taken, to the point where now you're having to put in even more effort that you're not used to. That type of effort is not what you're used to.
yes,
It's actually more strenuous to work on a basic level. But if you point AI at the right aspect of the workflow, like
yes,
with OKRs, was like, how do I get all my data in one place in a
yes,
way that like makes the conversation easier, or like fine tunes my OKR slightly so it's clearer or more intuitive, or whatever it may be, but don't take out the core part, which I think Dan was talking about, which is like just talk with people, meet with people, have the tough conversations. So I think it's like people were, and I feel like that's where some of the drop off comes from in AI, is people don't realize that you need to get really pointed at what you want it to do,
hmm,
or what you want it to accelerate. Because if you accelerate the wrong things, it's going to look cheap almost. It's going to feel inauthentic. But if you point at the right things, it's like that's the part of the workflow that can like elevate the value of AI in anything you're doing, especially when you're saying like going from 3 to 4. It was like, okay, now I can plug this in everywhere, in the right way. So
yeah. I think that's right. I think you know, there are kind of two issues that I've seen pretty consistently with in trying to use AI. So one of them is like automating the wrong things, or sort of like delegating the wrong things. And that I would kind of put in one bucket that's even slightly different from this other thing of like, for example, just telling the AI to generate your OKRs or something like that
yeah,
without a humongous amount of context. So that's like an issue I found with the technology. And like, you know, I've said this a bunch of times before, but like one of the biggest, most important changes you can make is stop typing and use like Super Whisper to do
yeah,
transcription, because more is more. Like we've gotten used to typing three words into Google and expecting to get like the first result. So it's like this pure retrieval interface in a chat box. Whereas like that's not what this is at all. The thing is a compressor. And so in order to have a good output, you need lots of high quality input.
right.
And so just like with the blog post thing, somebody's like, write me a blog post about like these three topics that are, you know, adjacent to my or I think the I think my internet went out for a second. It'll just produce like I've seen this on Twitter. I like the term like slop.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it just like produces, you know, repetitive,
Yeah.
all right, I don't know if
There we
I'm
go.
back. Catastrophic failure. I'm now my tethering on my phone.
Oh God. Okay.
Yeah, internet ISP is like completely out. All right, sorry about that.
No, it's all good. I was having a
But
good one-on-one with our note takers. Like, there's no. I was like in my head, I'm like, there's no such thing as a one-on-one anymore.
yeah, exactly. One on five, all these
Yeah.
things in here. Okay, so hold on 1 second. So we were talking about there's like the outputs that you can generate,
Hmm.
right? But the quality of the outputs, I feel like are like, whoops, very much contingent upon being able to have like super rich inputs
Yep.
that have like, you know, the qualities of being kind of, let's say, like high fidelity, so like raw recordings, proprietary, so it's not in the training set, right? But
Yep.
it's also high quality, so it's good stuff that you've actually generated through asking good questions, like having, you know, value creating interactions with customers, right?
Right.
And
You would generally think that that would lead to outputs if you used it, good outputs if you used it in the right way. Like, yeah.
100%. Data, and I would say it's like goal driven. Like I think having some idea of where it is you want to go in terms of point B
Hmm.
it tends to be pretty important. Now, what often happens is just like people are just doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the key is actually like all of this stuff. Like you need to actually go like acquire that prior to any sort of interaction with this.
Yeah. Even if you take AI out of this, if you're looking at any systematic approach to problem
True.
solving,
Yeah.
system. Like you can think of it as like a GPS, right? You're saying like A to B, and that's what clicks in my mind is like if you want to go to A to B in Google Maps, you need to know like what's the mode of transportation, like where you're starting from, where you want to go. Do
Mhm.
you want to avoid tolls? Like all this context that like if you want to get the right map or the right cross country uh travel plan, right? If you're doing any of this, you need high fidelity, very personalized, goal driven data. It's kind of a very professional way to say like get from place A to B, but all that's required in a systematic approach. So I think AI systems are just like extremely fast. And I think
Mhm.
people just need to understand that like the speed of it doesn't make it valuable. I mean, it can be, but the most value you get is when it can interpret your data better than you can, or at least in a speed that's better than you can. Like if you were just to mesh it all together or try to make it inferences on it.
Yeah, and the interpreting it better than you can thing is really interesting. And I think I originally got this. There was this very, very sort of weird book that was co-written by Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger of all people, and I think what's his name, Huttenlocher. I think he's at the MIT College of Compute. But they wrote this book, takes kind of an interesting mega historical view on AI, and one of the things they talk about is how the technology is a little bit it's kind of like a telescope or a microscope, right? And so it's
Yeah.
like you have all that input, just like you put like a cell culture or something under a microscope, you're going to be able to make legible all this stuff that you can now make sense of that you just like couldn't access before.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like no matter how much, like, if the knowing how to work with it better than you can is maybe not the right way I should have phrased it. It's more like you would have to put a lot more effort and time and resources to understand what AI can do and simplify without any other bias around it, like an output that you could eventually get to. But
Well, I would maybe even push back on that because I think this is where maybe we can tie this back to some of the OKR and the goal driven stuff. I definitely think that AI can insert, with caveats and whatever else, but like it can definitely um, interpret the data better than you can in certain.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I think an important part of that is you having clarity about the end state that you're trying to go to or the intent.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
and
I'd
so
say like also like the complexity of the data. Like if you're asking like a business, an enterprise business that has, you know, the significant amount and different perspectives of all that data that we've inputted here,
yeah.
I think definitely it could. I think like the smaller the data set, like yeah, like if I'm just trying to, the smaller my goal and the smaller the data set I'm providing, the more likely I could just use my, human intelligence. Like AI is maybe not going to have as much of a significant impact in my decision,
Mhm.
but the more that you provide it and the more like creative it can get and simplifying it can get to make that right decision. So yeah, it definitely depends on like I would say like the size and the quality of the input and like the reference of the goal at that point. So yeah, it's an interesting point about the goal aspect. Like I don't think many people contemplate that as much. So much focus goes into like context to input and then it works. But if you're not good at framing the actual output more than just like prompt engineering, right? The
Mhm.
output of where you want to go, then yeah, that's an interesting point I haven't really considered. So,
Yeah, and it's sometimes that is actually latent in the raw material. And like the examples I would give around this would be like meeting recordings. So
yeah,
if you're doing like you have a client interaction or like a sales call or something like that, I found um so a common example is I try to do as much like coaching from the system, like try to ask it to, you know, give me some feedback, right? Like what are some ways in which this could have gone better, why, use specific examples, and then traverse that, as much as it makes sense. And I would say like that line of questioning ends up being useful probably about 50% of the time.
mhm,
But I don't even necessarily need to specify, oh, I'm trying to turn this person into a customer, or
right,
or even actually a better goal is I'm trying to help them solve this particular problem because it's latent in the data in the conversation, like it's sort of in there.
yeah, yeah,
I've noticed like Claude 3 Opus and the bigger models are just better at figuring this stuff out. They tend to just see it.
yeah,
Now,
yeah.
if
I think
that's yeah.
no, I was gonna say like the one way that you did that, I think in the call with Christian was like that I found really interesting was you had it sort of reread the document as if it was, and you were like, um, what percentage of someone would, or what's the likelihood that someone would respond to this LinkedIn post? Like assume that, like you didn't have, they already had the context of who you were writing from before, and you're like, all right, let's improve it from 80 to 90%. And that was an
Yes.
interesting way to like capture that mechanism of like, you already know what I'm trying to achieve here. Now use that context to help achieve it. Don't just take like write a better version of this. You're like, for this specific goal of someone reaching out at the end of the day, focusing on that. And I don't have to repeat anything else because you have that context from, as you're saying, in the latent fashion. So that was like one of the most interesting ways I've seen like a chat like that go, with that in mind. So
No, 100%. And that's where it's like there's some McKinsey data out that says, you should invest $3 in change management for every dollar that you invest in the technology if you're doing like
mm,
enterprise integration. And in my experience in like an enterprise setting, like doing this stuff, like I would say that that's quite true.
mhm,
Um, I think I think there are probably a lot of interesting product opportunities in the space, whatever else. But I really do think that this shift to like a fundamentally different way of thinking about interacting with computers and even the nature of like how work gets done and how you think about like where the human fits into this overall structure that's trying to pursue some goal, whatever it is. It's very different.
mhm,
uh, and the goal oriented nature, I think, of the most fruitful interactions is really at the core of it. And that's why maybe it's given the experience with like the OKRs and everything else being a little bit
yeah,
biased, or maybe seeing ahead of on this a little bit. But
yeah,
it's honestly like, I mean, if you're prompting people,
yeah, yeah,
like that's kind of why the OKR stuff works so well, is if you specify the intent and the intent is clear, then you can work backwards from that using like
right.
counterfactuals and all these different, reasoning, like intellectual mechanisms to try to accelerate progress towards your goal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my bias is going to be extreme. I mean, I've worked at a company that built OKR software for 5 years. So
Yeah.
I'm going to like, and then ran an AI team there. So,
Yes.
yeah, I have to own that bias very strongly, but, it is one of those like frameworks that's like, I think the big question right now of people implementing AI is like, what is our AI strategy? But then the sort of follow on question is, what is our ROI on it? And it's kind of like that answer. Because it's such a general technology, it's hard to say like, and can be applied in infinite amounts of use cases.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you need to find the one framework to measure that also captures all the infinite use cases of your business, which kind of goes back to like, yeah, how can you, is our OKRs like the ROI mechanism for knowing if AI is working for you in the right way? Or you're
100%.
investing that like $3 per one in the right allocation within your team. Like if you have a budget for it, where are you going to put your AI budget? Is it in, this particular function? Is it this particular challenge that you're overcoming that crosses different functions? Like
Yeah,
that's kind of where the question goes with it. So
I 100% agree. So I think there are a lot of good threads that we could pull on. And like when it comes to, okay, sort of the OKR process, goal setting, and then just, execution towards, in that direction, there are so many different ways that you could insert AI into the process. You have sort of the planning and setting,
right.
pursuit, reflection. And I think, this model, this sort of like general model of how to think about using the system. And then of course, you got to remember it's discursive, right? So you're
Right.
kind of going back and forth. I think is always important to point out. But it's like, let's assume you're already in motion.
Yeah.
Then you can quote hire AI to do these different things where you just wouldn't have had the capacity. And that becomes a forcing function for experimentation, user-led innovation, and you start to figure out things from a bottoms-up approach.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, are you kind of thinking of it as like, let's say you're in motion, you have a strategy, you translate it to OKRs, and then it's sort of like, all right, we need to find the accelerators here, and
Yes.
using AI to help, perhaps even like my thought was like you actually use, there's two ways. There's like version one, which is you can use AI to help you inform, given the context of your business and today, like what are the key action items that you can take to help accelerate key result progress. And then like the very like meta approach to it is, can you have AI actually come up with AI-driven solutions that help accelerate your business. So it's like a buy if you are an organization that knows you want to change the way you work, and the AI is that lever to pull. Can you
Yeah.
use AI to help you find new ways to use AI? So it's kind of a
Yeah.
like that's why like I think when I mentioned like the ambassador program before, that was almost the function that we used was giving AI tools for our team to figure out new ways of working with AI that tied back to their OKRs. So it's almost like, can we actually accelerate that here in a more
Yes.
like systematic approach that doesn't require lots of education or like a massive culture shift in people's thinking, or like misallocating resources and spending too much time thinking about it and more time, finding solution, doing it, trying it, experimenting. So
100%. And so it's like you can maybe think about it as like you can use AI to help you figure out what to do,
yeah,
and then there's the actual doing of the thing.
yeah, because that's my experience with OKRs is like I always want to like add in one extra letter on there and then think it's like way too confusing, but it's all about like the actual execution of it. Like you have your goal, you know what success looks like with key results, but then teams don't necessarily plan or at least what I'd say is experiment the right way, which is test something out, execute on it, see what the results are, double down if it works, scrap it if it doesn't. That sort of like execution measures, whether it's planning for projects or taking on specific initiatives, sometimes they get translated into a key result, like do this or complete Y or whatever.
Hmm.
But that step of like having a really calculated plan, like a hypothesis testing of like we're going to do these 6 things that ideally push these key results and drive this objective forward, can we actually get smarter about the experimentation of like what is it we're going to do? So figure out what we're going to do that's maybe
Yeah.
elevating our thinking or
Yep.
making us think more creatively about our approach. Because it's almost like if you look at B2B sales now, you
Yeah.
go on in and everyone is a clay.com influencer.
Yep.
And everyone is doing now the same AI enrichment. They've got the same sales templates, and like the sales jobs that are hiring are like very tough to get now. And so people are getting really creative. Like I think I've never seen as many like founders getting like written mail as I've seen today. Like people are
Hmm.
now handwriting mail because it's the only thing that stands out from like AI driven inbox.
Interesting.
So or like I was working with one customer who, or a client of mine that we were hiring for a, like a head of growth essentially. And they like sent like a really, really unique like Twitter DM. And it was the one that stood out from like all these like other applications that maybe felt a bit like ingenuine or AI driven. It was like, how do you stand out from the rest or get that creative? So I
Mhm.
wonder if that's the same thing here with business. Is like if you traditionally asked AI, like, how can I achieve this OKR? Let's say you have like a salesperson or a sales team. They may give some sort of generic answer, but if you can give it the context of we've tried these methods before and these were the results, or this is what we like to do, or this is our, is how we want to position our brand or something like that, it can take in that context and be that sort of creative juice to come up with like new tactical ways that you maybe haven't thought about. Maybe that goes back to our like original conversation of like, can it actually make better decisions for you? It's like, can it actually unlock creativity to helping you achieve your um, OKRs in the sense? So
100%. So I think there are a few things, a few threads I want to pull on here. Just kind of this question of quality versus quantity, because you have these competitive dynamics, like in sales, for example, and
mhm,
thinking about what's durable through that
yeah,
um, is important. Because I think the tactics we've also this has been like very abstract, but I think it'd be good if we could start sharing some concrete examples. Like I'll share one, and then maybe like I would love to hear like the ambassador teams if you can share
yeah,
some of them. Like, what are some concrete examples? Things that worked, didn't work.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, that's always a good stuff. And then we'll talk about this idea of like again. So we talked about doing the slice of the thing, but then the figuring out what to do.
yeah,
That thinking about how AI does that because I don't I don't think it gets a little bit fuzzy when you look at this closely enough, but like AI making a better decision, the human is still making a decision because you're taking an action of some kind. Like these things are not really acting even in the digital world per se.
Right.
But it can certainly influence and inform your decision-making process. And so what that looks like, we'll talk about. All right, so let me see if I can thread a couple of these together with a concrete example. I had this one client who, professional services firm, and they do like management training for companies, a lot of like PE backed kind of like mid-market companies, and then we're looking at going up market to
Yep.
like enterprises, publicly traded, rolling out like a new scalable offering, all this kind of stuff. And so I was helping them run their an OKR cycle, really focused on growth, kind of in this new segment that they wanted to go after. Somebody had come on as like a full-time BD salesperson to sort of help just handle the go-to-market motion around this. And we had identified a few different targets or prospects that were those kind of big enterprises. And the question became, given that it's it's one guy, whatever, who's responsible for doing the outreach on these things, are there ways that we could really elevate like the quality of the outreach that he was going to do, and to do it fast? And so, very simple example was, okay, these are publicly traded companies. Go to the SEC filings, right?
Right.
And so we kind of sat down together, and there are like some specific needs or signals that were kind of, or characteristics around like the persona, which would be like a HR executive or something
Right.
like that, buying against. Had all that in mind, right? So had kind of like the intent, the context, all these things. And then I worked with a BD person who opened up Claude, and love Claude. Always gonna promote Claude. But opened up Claude and then downloaded a bunch of the most recent like 10K, 10Q, whatever the most salient filings were, going through the list of prospects, and then engaging in a conversation with it to try to tease out the insights.
Yep.
And then ultimately incorporated some of those into like really precise outreach that kind of called back to like certain things that were in the report about employee engagement and hiring things and various other challenges and transitioning to like remote work and these kinds of things. Through that process, I think one thing was interesting to note was we didn't just like put that on full auto.
Yeah.
And he was pretty meticulous about actually like paying attention to the details and sort of like thinking about it, right, and engaging in a dialogue with the system. Think about, oh, how might this person respond, sort of like the Christian example. It's like those techniques of like, how likely would this person be, copy and paste their LinkedIn profile in and
Yeah.
whatever. How
Right.
likely would they be to like respond to this? Oh, it's probably this. Okay, what would it do to elevate it? And so it's this like kind of iterative thing.
Yeah.
Where you're using AI, you're still going very fast, but you're like focused on quality. You're not doing spray and pray stuff.
Yeah.
Now, because you're not going to get 100% response rate or whatever, right? Like you have to scale something to a certain degree, but all of that time and energy that you save, instead of trying to scale something up with like the full auto AI slot blasts, why not instead go a little bit narrower and actually use your empathetic, human, mind with a charitable disposition, the people you're trying to reach, to like really figure out like what you can do to connect with them and like understand their challenges and start a fruitful conversation. And I think it's like you were saying with the Twitter DM, I have no idea how that person constructed it. Maybe it was full blown AI, but what I've seen in practice work really well is not automation.
Yeah.
it is this like compression and focus on quality
Yeah.
that ends up working. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it was it's that's kind of a similar use case to what we had in our, so one of the examples from our ambassador program, and just for context, what the ambassador program was basically, um I ran, as a chief of staff, my job was basically like if there was a gap, fill it, and the gap there was AI, and it was like,
Yeah,
okay, I'm just going to run a task force. And so it was myself, two project managers, and then roughly like 8 software engineers, all fully focused on how do we build AI into the fabric of our organizational operation. We weren't external facing, we were purely like a product team
interesting.
internally.
Okay,
And it was basically like the ambassador program was just our way. So my job in that was just like capture as much stakeholder feedback around their biggest challenges and opportunities that they see with AI, and then have the project managers and our engineers like design these internal tools to be able to amplify it and test it and just really experiment with it. And some of them took off, some of them didn't. But one that was really interesting for, well, actually, one that failed was that sort of like personalized outreach at scale. It was like we almost tried to balance because we were like an enterprise sales motion. It was like,
yeah,
hey, can we at a particular account find the 10 likely people with the job titles that are like closest to our ICP? So we were able to do that with Salesforce. And then, then you get to the stage of you do all this prompting, and you engineer the product around it, and then you get to the output and you're like, this doesn't feel right. Like it's not hitting home the way I would want to.
yeah,
And so someone would then have to like think through those 10 people and put in, as we're sort of saying, like a new level of effort that they hadn't had to do before. It's
yeah,
kind of like now they became editors,
yeah,
which is not their primary skill set. And so it like wore it down. And it got to a point where like even thinking about going forward with this project, we're like, all right, scrap that. We're gonna then, as you said, like keep it the same relative speed of or like motion for the sales team, but maybe provide them a little more context that they wanted. So we like built in like in Salesforce, like our own application there that if someone ran it on an account, it would basically go find more information about the account. And the unique part for us was because we were an OKRs platform, we actually, based on the company research and that person's job, we drafted up like 3 OKRs that the
yeah,
salesperson could include in the outreach. Be like, hey, like if you're running an OKRs program, I would assume maybe your company is focused on this based on your 10K, and
hmm,
this would be an OKR. So it was like we were similar to what you were doing in the research and the sort of refining the quality. We were almost going about it slightly differently. I wouldn't say it's like quantity, but it was like providing them with something that would be perhaps useful for personalization. It was like just kind of like giving them an extra tool in a toolkit, if they wanted to use it. And that was our way of kind of enabling them with research. So it's like kind of amplifying the research aspect, because they didn't have to do as much research and they could focus on that, high quality, like driven output similar to your client as well. So kind of two different approaches to it, but the ultimate goal was like spend less time doing the stuff that doesn't actually help with, or not, it does help, but we want you spending more time on the stuff you're really good at, which is capturing attention, personalizing, and driving the value of the product. And if we can accelerate some of that research or put it in a context that's potentially more unique for the personalization, that's what we'll focus on from an AI standpoint. So
that's super interesting. And so like the value there is you're kind of helping those sales reps like overcome the blank page problem,
yeah,
where they maybe could have been able to come up with like a few different key result candidates or something like that, but it's you kind of compress that, and now it's something where it's available to you. You don't have to use this template. It's not kind of like pre-drafted in your
right.
um,
And
Gmail app.
it helped them look, because when you're a salesperson there, like they aren't OKR experts, but we want to show that like the any salesperson wants to show some subject matter expertise. So we're like, how
Yeah,
do we sort of enable that in some way that's, rather than them spending a bunch of stuff about like the OKRs methodology, is just like, all right, this is hyper personalized and it looks like they read through the information and we're able to transform it into an OKR, which is exactly what our clients are trying to do. So it was
Yeah.
kind of this, as you said, going back to the goal of it all, was our goal was to build trust with those companies in our initial outreach on a particular focus subject there. So
That makes a ton of sense. I love that example. Did you measure that, like, I don't know, some kind of KPI or like sales velocity metric or something?
not really. It was at a point where we were very much changing our ICP like to enterprise focus. So to know how often it was used, like this was one of the things where it was our approach with the ambassador program was we are not going to kind of like force this on people. It is there and available. So it was kind of like some sales folks like may have used it, some may not have, depending on what worked for them or not. But the fact that we were able to do it just provided some sense of if this kicks on, then it can do. So we don't have any measurement on it, but um, the one that was there was another experiment that was more cross functional that I wish we could have figured out that was similar to the sales dynamic, um, which was actually a collaborative. And this is why I love the ambassador program was
Hmm.
we had one person from at least one person from every function. We kind of kept it small to start with. And there was one challenge of when it came to sales and kind of communicating our value. When you think about like an OKRs platform, the challenge we had was we have that sort of like everyone's our ICP challenge, which was like everyone can use this, but how do we figure out like the best way to frame this for particular people? And
Yeah.
so our marketing team would work with our sales team on building like the from our template of like 160 slides, like how do we figure out like the perfect slide deck for this particular customer? So
Yeah.
yeah, it was actually like we tried to do this, and this was, I think, just around when like OpenAI had allowed for like PDF uploads. Like it was very early on when you could bring in documentation. But we were using it in our like own internal LM, which if you ask me any of the details of the technology, I don't know how how that all works in detail, but it was basically like everything's in-house. And we were trying to figure out a way of if we had it, and we could probably do it now because the capabilities have changed, but it was like we fed it our master template deck and then we
Mhm.
provided the ICP of who we were talking to, can I actually recommend to our sales team what slides to use and like notes to talk about. So it was like they would be empowered with like the perfect sales deck for this person
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
helped us overcome kind of the everyone's our ICP model. We just
Mhm.
couldn't functionally get it to work right because I think it was still in the phase where like the AI wasn't reading PDF pages of a PowerPoint very well. But that's where I think the cross-functional collaboration was like very interesting in that, yeah, the first version of like doing research and finding OKRs for a company was very specific to that team. But this was now like you involve two teams who are trying to come up with a similar problem and they're now engaging on it because there's a new capability out there to do it. So yeah, it's kind of a
That really interesting. So you were in that case, then it's like you have this proprietary data, you have this data asset, which is like the distilled, knowledge that's encoded in this, in this like comprehensive deck, right? And what you want to do is, okay, given this prospect trying to affect this result, make a compelling pitch to this person, let's carve out the exact right bits and pieces that are going to be salient and
yeah,
give it to the person in this kind of like nascent like co-pilot setup, right? But it's like you have the intent. I want, as a sales, that's one of the reasons why I like working with commercial teams. It's like it's pretty clear what you're trying to do, right?
yeah.
Um, so you have that intent. Again, you have the proprietary, gold standard sort of input that the company has. It's not in the
Mhm.
model, and then you have the context around the customer, and that's enough to get started. I think, yeah, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. Um, I think that a couple of like general takeaways or general ways to think about this a little bit is like the technology, I think, acts as this extremely general indexing or sort of like sorting and filtering mechanism
Mm.
on raw data that you have. So if you think about, you have like a big spreadsheet, like everyone's used like Excel or Sheets or whatever it is. There's like, I can kind of give two examples. One would be like let's say you have a list of prospects and you have a good sense of what your ICP is, because the limited resource would be the salesperson's attention. You want to figure out how to bump something so they can just run through a queue where they're most likely to have successful
Yeah.
interaction, whether that's outreach or calls or whatever else. Concrete example I'll share. I have to give full credit to my friend and somebody I partnered with a couple of times on AI stuff, Ryan, who hopefully maybe we'll do one of these at one point. We did a project where he was able to figure out how to take all of the LinkedIn connections and enrich the profiles of the CEO of this company, and then articulate the ICP and have an LLM do like a qualification scoring based on that.
Mm.
I actually didn't think it was going to make that much of a difference versus like what the heuristics they were using before was. He actually doubled their pipeline doing
Wow.
this, because it was able to see something in the unstructured text data that was like parts of the profile that weren't legible to like the other kind of scoring mechanisms that they have. Is super interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like at the level of like people that you want to take action on, in the case of like prospects or something, AI can act as this like indexing, sorting, filtering mechanism. Again, microscope, telescope, it's sort of, there's like parts of what's been digitized that is now legible. And so you kind of score it or quantify it, or, turn it into a queue accordingly. And this is like the what to do thing,
Yep.
right? But then there is doing it.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's like the quality thing. And so it's like, okay, once you have this queue sorted, now it's like, okay, we're going to focus on this top 10%.
Yep.
And now you get into, okay, so I'm going to put in, it's kind of like you flip into another one of these where you have, this is actually your slide deck that has all the information here. It's sort of a weird way to think about it, but
Oh, I see.
you are indexing and filtering and sorting now the information that is in the slide deck
Yeah.
to its essence, such that you can then now take it to the
Yeah.
prospect.
We had a second Salesforce app that was called contact prioritization, which
Yeah,
was basically you import all your contacts from like 6sense or LinkedIn or wherever outreach lists. You put it in, you clicked a button, and all we had from there at the time was just like the job title. And we basically just gave it the context of like what our solution is. And we're like, just give us the top 10% of the contacts. So it kind of scaled to, if you were working with SMB to enterprise, it was like, give me the 10% of people that would likely be a buyer or someone that would take a meeting. So we
yeah,
kind of did that, but we didn't have those next steps of like, all right, well, how do I now further use AI to act more appropriately on this? Like we did some of the work for them, but it was like, what are the next steps that we can go further on with this? And I've actually seen this used as like, I don't know, have you used clay.com?
I'll be honest, I've tried like 3 or 4 times at this point, and I just have
It's
not been able to pick it up.
there's interesting use cases that I saw that was actually related to how to save on the credits, but it was like you come up with a list and then you use like their Claygent, which is their like AI agent,
Yeah.
to like build a score. And
Hmm.
then what people do is they get like, you can run your enrichments, but you can run them on a certain set of rows based on that. So it's like, hey, I've got a list of like 100 leads that came into my website today.
Hmm.
The Clayagent runs and does a score for the top, and it's like, then you can filter and say like, all right, give me people who scored 70% and above, whatever the score indicates.
Mhm.
And then it says like, only use my credits for the next steps of enrichment or crafting emails or whatever you might do in Clay
If it's in the top.
if they've scored 70% or above. So
Yeah.
what you kind of outlined there is almost like the tactical way to like save AI credits. So you don't have to run this on everyone in your CRM. You just
Yeah.
run it on the people that like, or at least the subsequent steps there. So it's like a super, you get more focused and focused and focused, which, as we know, with like using AI, that makes it better and better and better.
Yes.
Or at least the context build. So yeah, it was just
Well,
in my
well,
head, the way you were explaining was exactly how I saw like people using it for that reason. So
100%. I mean, I think where this actually gets really trippy is like, you know, I think you can go a little bit crazy, like thinking about this stuff because you almost, we use these systems for like enrichment of information, but what are we ultimately trying to do?
yeah,
Is we're trying to reduce uncertainty around an outcome, which would be like a transaction, like a commercial outcome of some
right.
kind, or like you're serving the customer. They're doing that because it reduces uncertainty that you're going to help them overcome their number one challenge where they don't have the capabilities to do it. And so that's why, people make transactions like in a market or whatever. But always that limited resource is attention of some kind. It's sort of
Yeah,
like where you're going to apply your intelligence and act in the world. And so
yeah,
like when you're doing a call with a prospect, you're enriching the database by reducing uncertainty around certain information and qualification criteria, which you discover through questions.
right, right. Yeah,
And so it's always the same process of how do you continuously like resort and figure out how to get better and more precise around what exactly to reduce the uncertainty around
and
until
I think that that's kind of the exact thinking that is you could apply this to back to like the OKRs and sort of like what are you going to
100%.
do to move the needle is like
Yes.
you index, filter, and sort all of the opportunities that you could take on. So you give
Yeah.
it like, hey, I have these resource constraints, I have this time limitation, and we've tried this before, and this is my team.
Yep.
So like, and this is our tech stack, and this is our process. Like, this is our system. Like, of all the elements in a system, you feed it that, and you give it the outcome, and it gives you a number of options that you can go, and you can ask it like, what is the similar to your like what's the percentage that someone would answer this? Make it 70 to 90%. You can
Yeah.
do the same thing in here. It's like, hey, what's the risk and reward for every option I could take here? And
Yep.
say, okay, this one's like, you know, 30% chance of success because it's pretty out there, but it's really easy to implement. And if it does work, like it's going to take this OKR to the moon, right? It could be that. And so then it's a matter of doing the work is then using AI to actually execute on that AI driven idea. So it's kind
Yes.
of like you're applying that same matrix here now to not just like a contact list or prospects, but a initiative list or
Yes.
execution list. So
Yes.
yeah.
Although I have a little bit of a contrarian stance on like the AI execution thing. I'm sort of an AI agent denialist. I don't think it works. I don't
Oh,
I
you
don't
mean in that like going further right and executing on it, or
yeah, I don't think I mean, it's very hard to know the future, like, but I think actually a better way of thinking about this is it actually makes you much more agentic. Like
oh, I
ultimately
see.
I mean, I think in general there are problems with the technology around reliability where like
Yeah.
doing like the right functions, doing read functions and gathering and compressing information, the stuff is already quite good at. In terms of like taking action on your behalf, I think it's going to take a very long
I'm
time.
the same way. I'm still very hesitant to take output and copy paste immediately. Like it's not
It's just
safe
way
for
too
me to do.
unreliable. Like
Yeah.
yeah. But I think there's an interesting way in which, and this gets back to kind of this paradox of like the more you use AI, the more difficult the things are that you're going to have to do because you're so far outside of the model or
Hmm.
what's easily predictable that you have to like really think about it and like run experiments.
Right.
You necessarily quote become more agentic because you now have to actually like take more action to get the stuff that's not digitized that would help you make better decisions in the future. Um, and so I think to that end, when you're operating under these conditions of like lots of uncertainty, which is also high risk, high reward, there's more like asymmetric upside. And again, this is sort of the way I do like the OKRs, the crazy focus and everything is kind of like fitted to this. I think this is where it gets very interesting in using AI as sort of like a thought partner, or like an extender of like this kind of your traditional double diamond shape um, for figuring out what to do, right? So
Mm,
in traditional like design thinking or whatever, you come up with a whole bunch of different options as far as what, framing the problem or what problem to focus on, and then what are the different solutions that we could try. And I think here's sort of without AI, right? Like let's say this is something I've done a couple of times with clients, is like literally, we realized across the three key results, there was one that needed the most attention, where it was like the biggest gap. Like I always use the confidence scores, like in radical focus, to guide
yeah,
things. Like, what's the biggest gap between where you are and where you want to be? Okay, let's totally focus on there. And we would silently write a whole bunch of, you know, um, ideas around like what is the part of this problem that we should then focus on, have people share that, and then literally copy and paste that into like Claude and say, come up with
yeah,
50 more of these. And because you have the live transcript going with Otter, give it all that context of everything you've talked about already.
yeah,
So
right,
basically what happens at that point is now you've gone from like, 20 to 100 possible options. And, maybe you pick one or two of the AI generated ones for like consideration, and then you collapse it into something.
yeah,
Right. And you do the same thing on the solution side. So it's the human still making the decision, but in
yeah,
terms of generating way more options, there's this kind of this like augmentation thing that happens where
right,
it's extrapolating things out because it has knowledge of things that you don't, because it's just been trained on everything.
right,
And then compressing all that and doing that process again and just doing it fast.
yeah,
That that's it gets you closer to then taking a single action that is
yeah.
likely to reduce uncertainty the most.
And I think that's similar to like the even if we go back to like the conversation of like writing an OKR is like the first way. Yeah, you could have AI write one OKR and then write all your OKRs for you, but you're going to have to. That's a high risk scenario that you're
I am
probably going to
so
have to.
opposed to that.
Yeah, it's the way
Yeah,
that the way that we I remember when Quadrant first had the opportunity to do it, we were like, let's just have it be a suggestive thing, similar to this. It's like
sure.
it will know the context of you and your job. We're not going to allow you to click create it and it will do it for you. Like you have to provide the context, and it kind of becomes just like a templatized working thing that just puts in the right format for you. And
Yeah.
we got feedback that it's a great educator for
Yes.
people who didn't know the method, but like outside of that, there's like a lot of risk to it. So it's similar here, is that what you're doing in terms of understanding the initiatives and sort of facilitating that is sort of like how AI should be used with OKRs and that creation process, is that it should be a facilitator to get you to a better outcome. So this in a way is like also helping eliminate some of that bias of
Yeah.
like, hey, this is all my context, but like you can prompt the AI to be like, don't take my bias, like come up with other things that
Yeah.
might be there and then compress
Go
it
out of
back
the
down, as
box.
you said. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. One of my favorite little prompts for that is, you know, um, having it sort of like score the ideas or whatever so far on like
mhm.
a 1 to 10, how crazy are these, or something like that, and
Yeah.
then say crank it up to 11, right, and
Yeah.
just see what happens, right.
Yeah. You set their
Most
expectation and they try and catch you by surprise. And
Yeah, exactly, and it's this like extender or whatever, right. Now in
yeah.
terms of goal setting, I'm not personally super opposed to and we haven't really had like a discussion around like what is an OKR, where is it sort of appropriate,
Mhm.
or whatever, because I think that it gets used interchangeably with goal setting in general, but it's like
Yeah.
you have, at least in my sort of view of things, you have two buckets generally. You have like KPIs, maybe is one way to call these things, which are more about like fighting creeping entropy. So it's you're in kind of like a steady state, and maybe you're maybe like focusing on like kind of, okay, keep the train
Mm,
on the tracks. Maybe we're going for more nines of reliability or something, right? And it
sure.
kind of follows the Simon Wardley like product to ultimately, commodity utility, like just get that more reliable, right? You don't want to introduce too much change, or something like that. And then with OKRs, it's you're creating order out of chaos. And so you actually are trying to put yourself into situations with lots of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that, and that's kind of different. And in those cases, and so my point about using this as an assistant and setting the OKRs, the more truly uncertain the part of reality that you're kind of operating in is, and is outside of the training set of the model, like almost by definition, if you're trying to do new things, it won't have been in the model, then the less you should rely on it because you're outside of it. But if it's a KPI where it's already known to a certain extent, then it's kind of like the conversation with, in the prospect call, the goal itself is more likely to be latent in sort of the data that's in there, if that makes
Interesting.
sense.
Yeah. I've kind of approached it in a way that like I've always seen like OKRs versus KPIs, which always like I hate seeing the versus because I'm like I actually see them as like collaborative
Yeah,
components
100%.
of like the way that Quantum discussed them previously was like KPIs help you run the business and OKRs help you grow the business.
Yeah.
And so the way that I've always seen it is your KPIs are the lagging indicators that should push you to focus or where your focus may land for your OKRs. So if your KPIs are not in the right place, those are initial indicators of future OKRs that can help influence change back onto the KPIs. So for example, if you're I'll say a sales team because it's easier thinking in functional units. This is where like I love working with teams to help them come up with company OKRs because there are so many ways to go about it. And that sort of like workshop facilitation is what I love doing. But when you think about like a go-to-market team, they may see like revenue growth and revenue growth slowing, right? Or pipelines slowing in some facet. And
Yeah.
that's tracked on a daily basis in their KPIs. So when they go to do OKRs, it's like, hey, what are we going to do? Well, really what
Yep.
the focus is like, what are we trying to change about our business that's going to influence a positive impact on these specific KPIs? And
Yes.
so that's where you start to get like this, the cog in the machine focus is like each of OKR is a cog in itself. And so hopefully that accelerates enough to move the KPI in the right direction. And then you have all of your cogs in one place, like aligned across your teams to help push that forward. So it's almost like the focus aspect of OKRs comes to both a combination of what is your overall strategy and how are you translating that into your OKRs, but also what are the things that are holding your business back from a KPI standpoint that you can ultimately focus more like leading indicators
Yeah.
onto those more lagging focus KPIs. That's the way I've sort of like changed that conversation for different people. And they see it a little bit differently where it's like, I don't have to do either or. They're actually in tandem with each other and they help influence one another. So that's where I've started to see the goal setting progress be a bit more of where I found to be helpful for those who think more systematically of loops and such is like, hey, KPIs tell you like what you need to focus on and change, and OKRs show you like how you're going to try and influence change on that. And it
Yeah.
becomes a sort of like, hey, if we did actually improve like the open rate of our sales emails, did that noticeably have an impact where we expected it to have happen? No? Okay, let's go back to the drawing board and go through that retrospective and find a new way to figure out what's going on here. And I think the more times you do it and you can feed that to AI, that's when like the what you should do gets even smarter because it knows about your past experiments, aka the OKRs, to influence like, okay, let's focus on this. So I think it's kind of like that again, that sort of facilitator of thinking when it can have the right context of what you've done and based on where you're trying to go. So
I 100% agree. So let me see if this visual like resonates at all. Like it's kind of a sense in which, all right, you're trying to do new things. As you do new things and reduce uncertainty on some kind of frontier for your business, you achieve certain outcomes where it's like it's more operational. These are important signals, so we're just going to kind of like pay attention to them continuously.
yeah.
If something goes wild, it merits our attention. Maybe in the moment you got to do something about it, but at the very least, you then take stock of everything, and then reflect and then figure out what's the new thing that you're going to do next.
Yeah, like it helps influence that status quo piece of any strategic planning that people struggle with, is like, where are we today? The
Yep.
KPIs kind of help with that and help inform.
Yeah.
I think where it then translates back to the do new things is also the where we are and should go is almost the approach as well. So how are we going to like, what is our general approach as a company to overcoming this? Like, is it through you know, different levels of distribution? Is it through you know, whatever it may be on whatever level and whatever team? This kind of functional model makes uh my brain happy in how the system thinks,
Yeah.
because it can scale to, you can do this on a company level, or you can do this on an individual level or a team level. Like, you could do this as an individual for like fitness goals, for example. Like, you want to run a marathon, you know that your KPIs are this, and this is where your health stands. So, what are you going to really focus on to help improve that so that you can get to where you want to go in the right way? And you
Yeah.
kind of have those development cycles. So, maybe it's like, hey, I want to improve. If I'm doing a triathlon, maybe I have to improve my strength. So, my OKRs for this next month are going to be like weightlifting and sort of the performance metrics around that, and see if it has an impact on these KPIs. If it did, great. If it didn't, back to the drawing board and like keep going in that cycle. So same way with a company or any team, this is the method of thinking of how I've usually run like OKRs thinking, or like systems building within companies, is like, if you build this approach, it makes it a lot easier to know when you also have to maybe change things up for the next quarter. Right. And you kind of see that almost ahead of time. That makes the planning a lot easier to, and the retrospective is much easier to digest if it works like that. So
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this part actually is one of the more interesting ones where AI is super useful. So it's
yes.
like,
Yeah.
just to bring it back to what we talked about, there's recap a little bit, like, we kind of jumped in. If you already sort of have a sense organizationally of where it is you want to go, you can use AI to delegate a slice of a thing.
Yep.
And a lot of people, okay, let's try to use AI to automate something. Um, it's not a terrible idea. It's going to be better if it's in the context of I think of doing the new thing that you should be doing.
Yep.
Um, Obviously, not every company has that process. That's why you and I have been able to, collect paychecks like today. Um, so it's not always intuitive or always done, or something like that. But yeah, like, so there's in the micro doing a slice of the thing and maybe then figuring out what to do next. So we talked about some of these things tactically. I
Mhm.
think where some of the AI stuff gets super interesting is then at the collective level, like the entire organization, figuring out what to do before you try to do the new thing is
Yeah.
actually, um, I saw somebody post about this on Twitter, and I realized that this was, I think, something that I kind of understood intuitively, but I'd never really articulated it, is like, before you even start talking about where to go, and I find this interesting because I think in a lot of like workshops and stuff, people start with mission and vision,
Mhm.
but that's not quite right. Like, maybe you do that to get the energy going a little bit. I think the
Yeah.
truth is you got to start with the object level of analysis of like, what the heck is actually going on right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It like my systematic approach to developing a strategy before you even get to OKRs is
Yeah.
like challenges and opportunities, like across the business. Like, what are they? Where are they? Where do they overlap? Where are the biggest ones that can struggle? Like, how do you compress them into, like, which ones fit in the time frame that we're thinking about?
Yes.
And so that's like, I think mission and vision are helpful there for perhaps those that are um, more driven by like founder led strategy, which is a
Yep.
bit different than sort of the data driven, where I think there's a mesh of the two that makes it really powerful. Of like, we're not
I,
just going to like revert to the mean based on data. We're going to use the intellect of people to
yes.
drive this company forward. But at the same time, intellect doesn't necessarily capture some big challenge that's either external or internal that really needs to take a lot more time uh, of resources to focus on. Like, mission and vision are really important, like not trying to undermine that, but I think in this goal setting progress of like, okay, we have these teams, we can communicate the mission and vision, but the most important thing for the next 3 months right now is to figure out how do I get these, as you were saying, like that chaos, how do I point it and organize it at the right thing, and do it in the way that makes sense for our business from a cultural perspective, aligned to our mission in the way that we want to do it as well. I think they become the mission and vision almost becomes like um, sort of tweaks to how like data may be interpreted for OKRs, or like the OKR may interpret data, then you sort of like fine tune and bring in the mission and vision just to kind of calibrate things to what your organization is looking to do and for what time frame. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that's a little challenging about this is it's not, there is this kind of like relational cyclical
right.
aspect. And I'd be curious what you think about this. I've come to like really deeply believe that uh that goals are actually not arbitrary, like good goals. I think people unfortunately set them arbitrarily. Um and I would go so far as to say that this is like a philosophical error, I think, um in like kind of modern thought. But in fact, the best goals and like what founder vision and sort of intuition and everything actually is that they like a true visionary, I think, actually is able to perceive something real. So it's not simply a projection of their own imagination or like arbitrary will, but it's actually something that they have encountered out in the
Mm-hmm.
world that really stuck with them. And there's maybe some unique perspective or like, you know, this is a reason why a lot of like entrepreneurs are kind of neuroatypical or whatever, is like the way that you're seeing things, just the information's like being processed differently. So, but what you're seeing is real in some sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I've always found it really interesting that like, uh, there, if I think more tactically about it, like the products that get developed, um, like the ones we see today, the founder started on those years ago.
Yeah,
It's not like some of them popped up, and I'm so amazed that like it was like that wasn't luck. There was something there, whether it's intuition or
yeah,
experience or something that drove them not only to have that vision, but bet on it to a point where it wasn't even seeing like a bet. It was like, this is an informed decision because I'm not like reading the future, but I've experienced something real. I've uncovered a problem that we can solve that many people can't comprehend today, either because they haven't experienced it, but when they do experience it, it will resonate with them. And I feel like that's kind of where the intuition lands with it.
yeah,
Um, and I think it's good to like, I think when you come down to then translating that to strategy, that's where things get a little iffy. Like I think a strategy based on pure theory can get a little tough. Like
that
it
too,
has to be, yeah,
100%,
yeah. That's
right?
where this starts to be a helpful resource for that. It's kind of like, okay, that's the general thought and direction we want to go. Maybe mission and vision isn't like the perfect translation of that,
Yeah,
but like this is where the intuition goes. And given that this is the data that encompasses that, so what is our strategy to make that become a reality? I think that's where it starts to like the roads cross, and you kind of have to decide like, how do you build this? Do you either just go straight on, you know, founder intuition? Do you go like the data driven approach, or do you find this like middle balance that kind of helps solve that? I don't know what that looks like because it's like taking,
very paradoxical,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Because you're doing two things that seem maybe on the surface level to be incompatible or something like that. But I
Right.
think I think the difference between somebody who's like frankly like kind of a charlatan or whatever, or maybe like unmoored from reality, it's all theory or whatever, and then
Mhm.
somebody who's truly like a surprising kind of like visionary who actually gets stuff done. It's sort of wild to see. Is it has to do with like this grounding in there are objectively true like facts that
Yeah,
are informing what is happening. And I think that then underscores like this part of the process of like just getting as much of the whole picture as you possibly can
yeah,
before you even start talking about what to do as being really important. I like to use the analogy of a corporation as like a body. like a human body or something like
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
And it's got the same root, corpus, corporation, right? It's a body. Um, and you know, I don't know if you meditate at all. I used to meditate quite a bit. You do a body scan,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're, you know, one of the best ways to
I can
figure out.
never really get fully through it. My brain just kind of like, all right, I'm at my hands, and then I think about something else, and then I get
Yeah,
distracted.
exactly.
So I go through about 6 of them before I actually do a full body scan. Yeah.
Exactly. It's hard, just like
Yeah.
getting executives to commit to a 5-day workshop.
Yeah.
But you know, it's like, but if you do it right, it's like in having that comprehensive assessment of like what is actually the case here.
Yeah.
Something about that process just brings clarity to at least the options of what to do.
Yeah, it's making it the best formulation and starting point is not necessarily having just the right people in the room to help decide this. I think that's when people think of an inclusive strategy. Like I always think it should be as inclusive to everything as possible, and people think that that's just people. But I think the most inclusive way to do that and capture that picture is through many different channels of methods, whether that's from, if you're in an organization, capturing like challenges and opportunities from employees across
Yeah.
the world. And if you are in a massive organization, that sounds really tough to do.
Yep.
But because we know AI can compress information, it's like this becomes a lot easier as long as you set up the channels to capture that information, like capture
Yes.
that perspective from the founder in written form, capture financial data in like spreadsheets, and do that in a way that you and even as like if someone's watching this and they're a chief of staff, like that was my position, is I was very lucky to have the perspective on the business that I did, because I sat horizontal. Like I was involved in like a bunch of different teams, and like was able to provide ideas on challenges and opportunities that like potentially other people missed, right? But we want to find a way to have the most comprehensive view of the status quo and where people want to go. And I think AI helps us compress that. And that's kind of what I've seen a lot of companies start to do with like the likes of, I think Notion's kind of moving towards this, where it's like if you have everything in Notion, then we'll be really smart with your information and can provide you like really quick context of your information. Or like Glean is one example. Even Quantum's getting into this now, which is like around a strategy AI, which is really about taking in the right context and helping you answer the toughest questions about your business, given that context that you're giving it. And that context can be like every data source imaginable, right? So I think there's going to be the most valuable. I know you were saying this before about like some AI products being like maybe, you know, maybe not like the most valuable ones. The ones I think that we're going to see take off are the ones that are taking a very comprehensive view at the inputs and the channels that are created for a
Yeah.
business that allow them to create the most impactful outputs. So it's sort of like, whereas everyone was developing like AI blog post generator or SEO keyword generator, that's great because it gave you a bunch and quick, but did it allow you as a user to give it the right context?
Yes.
And I found like the best tools be the ones where it's like Claude projects, where you can like give it a bunch of knowledge and you just know that it's foundational there. That's where I get the most value. If I sign up for an AI tool and it doesn't prompt me like 8 questions of who I am, what I'm trying to do, all this,
Yeah.
I can see the quality differ. And I think that comes back to like strategy too, which is like the more, if you're going to incorporate AI in the strategy planning or OKRs process, like the most value you're going to get is the compression and the capture of every data from every different perspective that you can get.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, the that's you know, that's why Salesforce is a $250 billion company,
Yeah.
even though it's like one of the most broken user experience, you know, system, you know, whatever pieces of software that people have to deal with. It's because at the end of the day, it is the system of record.
Mhm.
And that's absolutely critical. Now, I am very curious to see how this pans out in practice. I think something
Right.
about the nature of these models may even change the way systems of record work for a bunch of different reasons. One is I actually think like the disintegration of the corporation itself in a lot of cases. I mean, that's like a whole separate thing that
That's
we
a
can.
whole another hour and a half we can go on.
Yeah, yeah. But I think to your point, it's like where does the raw information live that can be made available to people who need to make decisions and take action, where it's trustworthy, it's reliable, it's fresh, it's high fidelity, high quality, like it has all these characteristics.
Yeah.
It is by default, like whatever the primary key of the index, the sort of whatever the main index is sort of correct. It's aligned with whatever the whatever's going to be the enduring direction that the company wants to move in, and all these sorts of things, what that looks like. Yeah, I mean, whether it's Notion or, I mean, I think these like AI note taker companies are in a lot of ways like kind of underrated, because
Yeah.
like for me personally, like I tried using HubSpot, I tried using a few of these like literal like CRM tools or whatever. My system of record is Fireflies and my Figma boards.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my system of record, right? And I know how to very quickly like pull the things that I need
Right.
by going in there. So
It just works that way. Yeah. It's kind of like the Notion thing where it's like I haven't used their AI as much, but even just the thought of having like I had one friend reach out recently that was like, hey, like we kind of want to have something like enterprise search, but we're not an enterprise.
yeah,
And we do all this stuff. And I think for the sales team, they were like thinking like Otter is one example,
yeah,
Fireflies is another. And it's like, yeah, those are great capture mechanisms, but also like not just capture. Now they're really fantastic. Like, I've used Fathom as well recently.
yeah,
Like they're really good at just pulling that information back out for you to make better informed decisions. And it's not just like decisions of like, the action items get pulled out. They're like actual strategic decisions that you can take or not, or you can ask directly with it, what should I do next, etc. So I think if someone can find a way, and I think this is probably where a lot of enterprises are going, and maybe where some startups are stuck right now in the AI space with enterprises, is like, hey, we want this to know everything about our business. And
yes,
maybe a lot of companies out there are like, we are stuck because we can't do that. So I'm interested to see of the companies that do. I think there was one, I can't remember the name of it. Their focus is on just helping companies build that infrastructure to feed into LLMs.
yes.
So it's like
There are a
that
lot
is going to
of those.
be, yeah. So it's like there's so much value there that then these other layers can tap into. But then with AI, you start to think like, will you need to couple these things, or does it just become one thing that you can talk to and get exactly what you need when you need it? So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, how it plays out in practice, totally fascinating. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, but whoever ultimately, like if you're the system of record, that's a very good place to be. Like
Yeah.
value will
Yeah.
accrue to you, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a few practical things then, like if somebody's trying to figure out using AI and OKRs together, we come back to like first principles. You've got this like learning cycle that
Sure.
stimulates growth. You kind of take stock of what's going on. Maybe from that you derive candidates for goals.
Yep.
Right. And this is kind of my point about like I do feel like sometimes people kind of like arbitrarily skip to, this is what we should be doing, or sort
Yeah.
of what else. But it's like, man, you got to do the body scan first.
Yes. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very high stakes decision in committing to something, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um,
It's
and
almost
so
like if you're starting with OKRs, you should probably just start like the sort of provocative way is just don't do OKRs just for the next 3 months. Track every KPI you can and just see like, I mean, that you probably don't have the time to do that, but it's like if
yeah,
you want to make the best informed decisions on your objectives, like if you don't have KPIs today, any at
yeah,
all, like
yeah,
actually knowing how you or your team or your business operates through KPIs will inform much better OKRs than you have today. And these
yeah,
KPIs can come from like financial records, or they can come from Salesforce, whatever. But
Yeah.
you can do OKRs, but I think the same investment has to go into the KPI layer, in my opinion. Like that is such an informative piece of this that
Yeah.
helps steer that direction. But yeah, the suggestive layer of I think is a great way to incorporate it in the thinking so that it
Yeah.
can whether it's on the key result specifically, even setting the right level of a key result, like that's what I see. It's an issue sometimes is some people set completely outlandish levels of like a target that
Hmm.
they know they can't hit. And then when they start going with it, they lose that pace of like focusing on it. So it's out of touch. But if you can find a way to maybe use AI to make a more informed approach of
Yeah.
hey, we'd love to, rather than say hey, we want to have a 60% open rate on our emails, the AI can be well, maybe we go with 30% because historically you've only reached 15.
Sure.
So something like that, like refinement of targets based on your historical performance and where you want to go. Or using it as a way to, as you were saying before, like that list building and sort of scoring mechanism of what is it we can do,
Yeah.
especially if you're in a position where you're just feel like you're kicking the tire in terms of things that we've tried before and haven't worked. Like this is a great experiment to try and um, you know, feel a bit of a different connection to a different perspective. So
I think that's totally right. And I like the in that case of the target setting, right? Like that is so critical. Man, if
mhm.
you get that wrong, it's like you
It's
just
behavior change. It really is. You could set too low of a key result.
yeah.
Someone hits it and the gas, they stop pushing on the gas when really your business really needed that progress to be much higher than what the target set. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And well, it's a little bit like the if you can maybe turn this into a good thing, like a lesson to take from like the casino industry or whatever, right? Is like there is that like liminal state, like right on the edge of risk, where
yeah,
you're gonna get that dopamine kind of
yeah,
thing, like stay focused and stay motivated, right?
right.
And I think what I found to work really well in practice with the OKR setting process is I have this definition of consensus that I actually got from the very first company I interned for when I was in college, which is that consensus is not your usual sort of goofy select decision by committee thing, but it's like everybody feels like the process was totally legible and just. They felt personally fairly treated, and they can live with the decision,
Yeah.
and that's it. And if you have those three things, then you have consensus. And I always try to do this as a check when the key results, the objective, and then the key results and the targets are selected. Is ensuring 100% of the people who are participating in that session say yes to each one of those things, like very explicitly.
Mm.
And around the target setting, I do the Christina Wadke thing, 50-50, right? Like, what is it where it's on the edge? And
Mm.
it's pretty interesting. People have like very varied initial ideas of what those targets should be,
Yeah.
which I think to your point, like um, without resolving, like having the collective intelligence to like kind of resolve it, um, you have one person who's selecting one key result for the group, like the target or whatever it is, without the input from everybody else. Maybe they stay somewhat motivated, but if everybody else
Yeah.
is not, then it's like the whole thing is just doesn't work.
That's where I think I don't know if you've seen it in practice. That's why I see the value of that facilitation of driving consensus in a facilitated way.
Yeah,
Um, because I've seen it where CEOs set OKRs or team leads set OKRs for their team,
yeah,
and you're like 1 out of 20 people now gets it, and the risk is so much higher if you do that at the company level, because
yeah,
then you're looking at the entire business units where the leader isn't coming to an agreement on, and there's
yeah,
risk there.
yeah,
There's inherent risk of them driving their team in the wrong direction or not at the right pace or not really having that energy that they should be there.
yeah.
And so that's such an interesting component of um yeah, the consensus building. I wonder, that's a component here where I don't think you're gonna overcome with AI
I don't know, man.
uh,
I wanna dig into this a little bit because I think that again, one of these paradoxes is like you ultimately have the CEO is making the call
sure.
on these things, right? Or the head of the business unit or whatever it is. They're making the decision on what the objective and the key results are. But they are going to be best able to do that with highly engaged democratic participation
Yes.
in the process, right? So
Agreed. Yeah.
and so if you can get both of those things, I do think AI is valuable. This is something I talked about on the interview with Dan. One of my favorite new pieces of technology are these voice agents.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the quality of the information that you can get is so high. It doesn't work 100% of the time. The UX is kind of goofy. Not everybody likes it. So where we are in 2024, maybe a survey is still like the correct way to go.
Sure.
You have things in kind of a in between space. There's a product I want to give a shout out to called a voice form that's very good. It's kind of in between, allows for voice input.
Mm.
It'll ask like good AI powered follow up questions, but it's not 100% discursive. But it's like, you know, back in the day, you would have had to hire, a consultant to do all these interviews. You have these transcripts, and then it's a whole process of even teasing out the things that like the executive team would, need to know to make a better decision. What you could do now is like put a voice agent with all the context behind a phone number, send it to a whole bunch of people, or send them these surveys, gather as much rich qualitative information as you can, asking
Yeah.
people really tough questions. Like some of my favorite ones are, anybody in the business, like at any level, it's like, okay, if the company fails, like in this really big
What was the
catastrophic
reason
way,
for it? Yeah.
why would that have been the case?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Right. And if you collect that perspective from you do the pre-mortem, every single person in the company, that's there's always going to be gold in there. It's like, oh, this is all this blind
Yeah,
spots.
that's what we did with um before I left Quantum. Like the last sort of push
Yeah.
was like the company strategy, and we basically just opened up an inbox and it was less tactical like that, but it was like, what is the biggest challenge that you think the business has today? Not you, it could be you personally, but the business. And it was like it's got a flood of emails from individuals, and like that was that inclusive process of getting that data. So I definitely could see it. I think my perspective is that behavior change, especially at an executive level, is really dependent on their own adoption of it. I think technically, yes, you could get to a point where that system is in place where you can capture all that feedback,
Yeah.
that input in the right way, and give the CEO the power to autonomously, but not really. Like it's democratically led, but it's they can make the decision and feel as comfortable as they would if they went through a facilitation. Do I see that maybe for like the most forward thinking companies that could work? At the same time, I do know the value that people have of getting people in a room together and like actually challenging each other's thoughts and changing that thinking.
No, no, no.
That's the one aspect. Yeah.
No. I think you need both. Like I think that's a like one of the things I was gonna, maybe provide maybe like an alternative to was the, first 3 months measure your KPIs.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the maybe a challenge I would put out to somebody is actually see if you can get like a full comprehensive picture of what's going on in your business,
Yep.
like in a week,
Yeah.
right? Try to use AI to do it. And so like one of these voice agents or the survey stuff or whatever is a means to do that. And ultimately, you're not getting around the fact that you got to spend like a whole day negotiating with the C-suite or whoever the decision makers are that have comprehensive like executive coverage of the organization about what, or if you're doing it at a smaller level, a cross-functional team or
Sure.
something, right? Of whatever the thing you have, is within your purview. But again, with this, just underscoring the importance of this, and I think where AI can be really valuable, the speed and fidelity,
Yeah.
quality and freshness of what you can incorporate, like front load and bring into that conversation is where this technology is powerful. So even if you gather all that stuff, you're the CEO. I'm not going through 30,
Yeah.
3,000
Yeah. Yeah.
things, and a lot of
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
not good. But maybe I trust Claude enough, Claude through 3, 4, whatever, to take a first cut at it. You load everything into Claude's working memory. And this is like a general pattern I do all the time. It's like, I don't have time to go through all these things.
Yep.
I do it when I send the VAPI agents to like group workshop participants. I'm not going through all the transcripts. I just pop it all into Claude and I say, okay, give them this, that, and that. Like, what are some interesting things that jumped out? What are some burning questions that I should address at the beginning? Anything anomalous, anything interesting, anything surprising? It's able to intuit those things, especially the bigger model.
Yeah.
And then work with it just like a person who's like a chief of staff, frankly, who like did go through all this stuff and has intimate knowledge. Now you can kind of do it in that mediated way.
Yeah, and I think when you do like a facilitation, your goal is to not teach people, it's to help them actually problem solve without being too much of an input. Like you're kind of the guide of the whole process, and having that full context of really kind of knowing where to push the room or at least facilitate them in the right direction can be influenced by all that context that you have, right? If you just go into an OKRs workshop and don't know anything about the business and you're trying to facilitate it, it's going to feel inadequate. It's going to feel choppy, where it's like if you actually know the context of the business and then are hearing the room as well, as a facilitator, it makes our lives easier of saying, okay, now I actually can, maybe the room actually isn't taking into account a lot of what the rest of the organization is saying. So how do I now weave that into the conversation? How do I set this up so that they're taking it in? So yeah, I love that approach. I thought you were going in the route of maybe this is where you're saying like the death of the organization was that like you actually don't need any other executives anymore. It's just one person, and you never have to meet again. But I went a little Black Mirror in my mind. But
no.
I definitely think like it also helps just get you more time in the conversations you need to have, right?
Yes.
Like less time gathering, less time analyzing, less time compressing means more time having fruitful discussions. Really going like spending more time with those challenging voices that like you need egos and personalities to conflict to build leadership teams. Like there's like the storming, norming, performing. This actually gives you that layer to do it with a full data set, not just on bias or opinions, right?
Totally. And this is one of the reasons why I'm like, I feel very fortunate that like the OKR thing and this whole, strategy management, whatever, like I feel very grateful. I get energized by this and I like to continue doing it over and over in different ways, because I do think this is one of these things that regardless of what happens with the technology, this is not going to change. These are like enduring perennial principles of human coordination. And just to riff on the point about the disintegration of the corporation, I'm not saying die. I mean, like literally like disintegrate, like you'll have, I think everything would just be a lot more dynamic and fluid.
I see. So, okay. Yeah. That makes me feel happy. Yeah. No, I love. I think we're one of the like it fall in that niche of like I could both talk about this for hours and feel like excited about it after. Like I think most of my like Claude chats are just like my super whisper of like me just randomly riffing on like walk through the grocery store. I'm like, oh man, what if we did this? And it was just like OKRs and AI and systems thinking approach to strategy and things. So yeah, it's super interesting, like where we can plug, like as this is our system, similar to like a sales team has their system, like this is where we start to think about like plugging things in, finding better workflows, optimizing things. But at the end of the day, there's a human element here, which I love, which if we can improve the human element around such a topic that people hate, like people really like I know
why do people hate this so much?
So I don't know, because I had this I've heard this a few times and I kind of agree, but then I go back on it. I'm like, wait, no, and it's like startups or high growth companies are allergic to strategic planning. I hear that and I'm like, I know they are because they're doing it wrong. And it's like if they went about it in a much more like systematic, integrated approach, like yes, developing a plan is like it sounds cumbersome in doing it, but it's sort of like that, or like Eisenhower, like plans are basically paraphrasing, plans suck, planning is indispensable. Right? And so it's like, how do you make the planning process a much more like effective or a much more like enjoyable experience for the human element. And I think if we can do that, people will stop thinking about strategic planning as this like archaic thing, because it doesn't have to be, but I think a lot of the practice out there is that it's done in very archaic ways and seen in that way, where
Yeah.
I think about it completely differently. I think it's like one of the most effective ways to energize an organization,
Oh, 100%.
or even yourself is, and then maybe that's like my type A, like love project planning and all this, but, and some people say like I love process, but I don't necessarily love process. I love systems. I love
Yeah.
integrating people, process, and technology
Yeah.
in a way that just makes things like 10 times better than they would if I tried to, just keep like
Right.
jamming the door basically. Like I'm finding a much more like cohesive way to do it. So yeah, I'm even riffing myself now and getting it. I'm now more energized about it,
No,
just
it's good.
talking
I
about it.
mean,
But yeah,
I think a big part of it is I posted a little bit of this on LinkedIn and on Twitter, but like there is very much this like cargo cult sort of like skepticism around like OKRs, but this is true of like any managerial framework,
yeah,
right? And the one thing I think that is common to things going right and people and organizations being energized is like, you know, it's what Aristotle talks about, eudaimonia, like true happiness is kind of this like perfectly fitted contact with reality where you're just like you're excellent at what you're doing, you're overcoming challenges, like you're kind of doing new things and whatever else. And I think like whether it's at the individual level or the organizational level, that's like really what you're striving toward. And
right.
so whether it's OKRs or any sort of other approach you could take, I think it's the real question is like, is this actually helping us achieve healthy growth?
Yeah,
Is it, in the context of like a free market, right? And sort of commercial organizations, are we serving our customers and helping them overcome new challenges,
yeah,
right? Like taking that very, having that kind of charitable disposition. And if you're just going through the motions and painting by numbers without always having it anchored to like that more kind of like the essence of what it is you're really like trying to do, which is you're something that's in motion that is constantly encountering new things under conditions of uncertainty and then learning from it. Um, if there's not like clear coherence between those two things,
hmm,
then then of course it's going to suck. And that's when you run into the situations where people go through the motions and paint by numbers, but it's like they never you're not getting like the good feedback from reality,
yeah,
because getting the good feedback from reality, again, coming back to the casino thing, I mean, you start, it hits the dopamine loop because each week you're discovering something you didn't
yeah,
know you didn't know. And
right,
you're like, oh man, like
yeah.
we got to go after that,
And
right?
this is where like strategic planning
Yeah.
turns from a traditional time blocked exercise
Yeah.
that doesn't fit the normal cadence of business today. Like, yes, we plan in quarters and we report on figures in quarters, but no business is now thinking like, oh, what's the challenge that popped up at the beginning of Q? Like, it's a evolving system. So like,
Yes.
if you can approach this strategic planning as a much more systematic approach, like systematic way of constantly learning about your business
Mhm.
and changing and funneling the focus to the right thing at the right time,
Yeah.
this becomes like I think there's a world where there's no time boxed OKRs anymore. There's just an expiration on them.
Hmm.
Like you can almost have it where you have different OKRs for different time frames all aligned to each other
That's
across,
interesting.
because each teams are working on different, like I have an objective for the next month and I'm going to use this to then inform my next one. Because if you make this process like much more systematic, there's a way that teams can operate in the way they should, without the methodology becoming a limiter. And so maybe I don't know what if that actually would work in reality, but like I think I always suggest the more like there's some things to be strict on and there's some things to be flexible on.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing to be flexible on in my mind is we don't want the methodology to change the the best way in which a team operates. So for example, like companies that are like, should we do team or individual OKRs? I'm like, that should be decided by whoever runs the business unit themselves. Like if you are a more team-based team, like engineering are based in pods and teams and squads and things like that,
Sure.
don't force them to have an individual OKR. Like
Right.
if that's not the way that they think about solving problems. So it's like, what is the best way in which they solve problems? Like, hey, we want to do cross-functional OKRs. Why? Well, we want to promote cross-functional behavior. I'm like, well, if you don't have it today, you want to be careful not to force goal setting on two teams that don't work together, right?
Yes.
It's much easier if the teams already work together, like marketing and sales, then you can have cross-functional OKRs. So I start to see now with like, if you build in these loops, that if teams are solving more problems faster and that's the nature of their team, then there is a question of like, do we actually have to have OKRs be like different for different parts of the team? I haven't really thought through that until now, but it's just popping in my head of like, that's maybe one of this ideas to strategic planning throughout the organization, is that it's adaptive, but it's still getting to the same point and all aligned with each other. So
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm more of sort of like an extremist about this, which is I just like won't work with clients unless I can do like the one objective, three key results thing, and it's either at the executive level or it's a
yeah,
single influence.
yeah. I we set the that's why quantum, like in the platform, you can
Yeah,
put a limitation and it's like one OKR per team. So it's like when I set that rule running our process, I was like, I don't have to check this. We can just build it in. I'm
yep,
in the same way of like hyper focus, one goal.
right. And I think it's not to say that there aren't different parts of the organization, like you said, that can kind of like autonomously adopt it as it's a good fit.
Yeah.
But I do think that having like a really good internal role model to start, where
Yeah.
people can just like organically become interested because things work in surprising ways,
Mhm.
that's going to be so much better of a um
It's an influencing factor of adoption of a mindset. Like
correct.
if you see your leadership team come out of a 3 day, 5 day workshop, have a very clear strategy, are
Yeah.
all energized and motivated about it, and can
Yes.
communicate it specifically for their teams, that goes so much further than like better written OKRs that they had. Like it's the human element of motivating and such is such an influence on how people adopt a
Yeah.
methodology or a practice. And I think, given how big this is of a practice, or how necessary strategy is for companies, no matter if you want to call it strategy or planning or whatever,
Yes.
um, that factor is always going to be there, which is super interesting to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think before we close out,
Yeah,
we maybe do like quick recap and bring it together. It'd be cool, I think, if we came up with like a couple of like very concrete things that somebody who's interested in figuring out how to like turbocharge their OKR process with AI, or maybe could become a little bit more goal oriented as they're like
yeah,
think AI. We could come up with a few of those. But I think on the point that you just shared, this like ultimately what you're trying to get to is rapidly taking the right action under conditions of uncertainty.
yep,
And that's gonna doing that continuously is where the energy I think comes from.
yep, yeah. It's like knowing when a new challenge occurs and knowing the scale of that challenge, and knowing, you could get it into the depths of like resource allocation measures and things like that. You could integrate that into your approach of like, can we actually tackle this challenge? Where would we have to reinvest our effort and time to overcome it? And then how are we actually going to measure our success in overcoming it? Like that sort of thinking is where I think ultimately most people want to go, and where high growth environments like startups do work in is like, see a new challenge, see a new opportunity, act fast, allocate resources. But as you scale, like that systematic approach gets broken because there are so many new challenges, so many
Yeah.
opportunities, so many resources, that it
Yeah.
becomes really hard to understand where that resource allocation is available. But how do we make sure that you're confident and energized to tackle it? And I think that's where like this data, and where you were saying about the capture, the pre-capture phase, or the capture phase, which is pre-planning or whatever it may be, becomes way more important the bigger your organization gets. So
Yeah. And no matter what, like I think this, the shapes of the things that we've talked about, there are these like general shapes of systems that
yeah,
emerge like at a certain point of scale.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Individual, cross-functional team slash SMB or whatever to like enterprise.
Yeah.
But this kind of like learning cycle, this sort of like rapid loop is generally going to be the case. And one of the key differences, though, where things have changed is because the scope of what can be computed has just discontinuously increased to include like words and sort of these other things.
Mhm.
It means hire computers to help you with those two things of figuring out what to do, because you can make qualitative data legible and thus, you know, actionable, indexable, whatever else. And then two, help you do it by then,
Yep.
as you're taking action to reduce the uncertainty, you employ AI to, you know, help you, you know, write, it could as simple as writing a
Yeah.
better email.
And
Right?
this is like, I think one takeaway from this is like, if you are looking to invest in uh integrating AI, like, you know, its capabilities, it's
Yeah.
almost like this is like the use case identifier. It's like, if you're using OKRs for it, use the OKRs as a way to place a channeled focus of chaos, which is maybe enabled through AI, to a particular problem, and make sure that that problem is the right one to solve. So I wonder if there's like, um, you know, a way to, it's sort of like AI strategy refinement almost. In that case, of like being able to see, based on my OKRs, where should I put my effort in AI? Or like, are there, yeah, I don't know if it'd be too much to like get the data on OKRs to see which ones are lagging behind and identifying potential use cases there. But
Yeah.
um,
I think absolutely. Um, so here's what I think would be a fun thing to do, actually. So I'm just going to share a Google Doc with you.
sure.
We'll do some of this like in real time. Um, so let's see, Claude. Okay. All right. So so I just sent you a Google Doc.
Yep.
Did you get that?
Yep.
Okay. So I pulled this up. What I'm thinking is, let's do this. I think two things would be kind of fun. One is, let's actually illustrate one of the things that we talked about, which is we'll come up with like, you and I silently for, I don't know, 120 seconds or something. We'll write down in I'll do a new page or whatever. So you can do it on this one, I'll do it on the other one.
Sure.
Uh, as many ideas as we can come up with, as far as like things that people can do with can do to try to set, you know, run a better OKR process with AI, or to be more goal oriented, or sort of like OKR driven with AI implementations and integrations. We'll then do the double diamond thing. We'll give it all to Claude plus the transcript of the conversation that we've had
Yeah.
thus far, which actually, unfortunately, the Otter might have gotten kicked out.
Otter, yeah, I'm on the, I think it limits it on the free plan a little bit. I'm
It
still
limited.
testing that one out. So
Okay, no worries. So maybe we won't be able to do this, but well, anyway, we'll give this a try. And then oh, that's annoying, because you know what? I was gonna put in the
I think the
conversation.
Fireflies has been on there though.
It
Is that,
has, but it doesn't have the live transcript, which is like,
oh, it doesn't? Oh,
that's like the one thing that's keeping me from uh
committing to it a little bit.
committing to it like 100%. Well, let me ensure that that's the case. So it says it's in here. Let's see if it. I don't. No meeting activities yet. Copy meeting. No, there's no live transcript. Well, that's a bummer, because what I was gonna have it do is then like
Uh,
ask really hard hitting questions at the end about, you know, whatever was unresolved. But let's give this a try. Let me set
sure.
like a
All right. So run ideas to run a better process with AI, and then the other is become more AI driven.
just like
Uh,
very concrete
yeah.
things that somebody can do.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. All right. So I'm gonna set a 2-minute timer.
Cool. Oh, I think you're on mute. I was wondering if we were still going. There we
Yeah,
go.
sorry, I'm dictating through Super Whisper
Ah, okay.
to this. Let's do one more minute. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see try to get 3 of these on here. All right, cool. So get a few of these. All right. Let's see if we can do this in real time. I'm just going to copy and paste all this. Claude.
Oh, you can take out the first 2 of mine just because those were
These?
just notes that I had. Yeah, those are just like the reference points. So
All right, I'm going to give you a number of suggestions that a couple of OKR experts have come up with as far as steps that people can take to, concrete first steps that people can take who want to enhance their OKR process with AI or to become more goal-driven or sort of OKR anchored in their introduction of AI to their organizations. Given what they suggested, I want you to come up with, 10 to 20 super wild and crazy, precise, innovative ideas. Um, you know, other ways that the companies could do it, and yeah, feel free to really think outside of the box here and be kind of elaborate and maybe a 7 out of 10 on the crazy scale. I don't know. We'll see what happens here. So I'll tell you
okay.
something. I've done variations on these two.
The VR simulation? Or is
Okay.
that
Oh man. Yeah. Yeah.
OKR
So
music? Oh.
I'll tell you, like, one of the dorkiest things that I've done with AI is, and this is like a longer term thing that I've been thinking about, is like for the OKR process to work, I think people have to really deeply desire the goal or like
Yep.
to want to attain it. And you get there through this process of getting the good information, negotiating it, and then encoding it in the objective and the key results. But what I realized, because my last startup was in VR, was when I started thinking about this. If you can encode that same information, the objective and the key results, into like really visceral media, so
Oh,
custom
what does the
song,
future look like? Yeah.
yeah, like through like Suno, which I've done, I actually did this before. This is like super kind of embarrassing, but I had this like really big pitch that I was like a little bit nervous for in front of like an enterprise C-suite. And so I took a bunch of the transcripts and I put it in a Claude and I said, can you turn this into like a power metal ballad?
That's awesome.
And I made a couple of Suno songs and I like went
Yeah,
for a run with like listening to them before I did the meeting.
that's
I
so
got
funny.
really pumped up to
Yeah,
be honest.
yeah,
Um, yeah, but it's like, can you then take like, you know, the objective and the key results, which are normally in slides or whatever else, but then like make them like really compelling, you know, like
yeah. Yeah, it's that storytelling aspect, and that's actually one of the things that I specifically had in there was one of it was something we haven't talked about, but it was almost like the communication of an OKR.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
I found that the most helpful OKRs are the ones that people invest time in writing descriptions for. So it's kind of
interesting.
like because they'll have like, you know, really aspirational objective titles and then key results, but sometimes they get the you get the question of like, well, why aren't you focused on this? What's the driving force behind the focus? And so like
Hmm.
having really clear ways of having descriptions. I was like, if someone writes an OKR, just have them really describe in full length vocally, and then be able to translate that into a one paragraph description that gets put on the OKR, so people can still have like really creative, ambitious, objective titles, but they leave the sort of like nuts and bolts of what it really is about in the description. So you still leave that sort of motivating factor and sort of the memory of like, oh, this like really creative objective title that's using like alliteration, for example. Is
Yeah,
that's what we try to do for like company OKRs, is like make the objective title really memorable, but
yeah,
sometimes it doesn't capture the whole essence. So making sure it has a description that's like very much like textbook to this is why we're doing it. This is why we're not doing these OKR, these key results, etc. So making that sort of description process, it's very much a you know, people got to type it out. They got to like, they just did the OKR. They don't want to
yeah,
rewrite it again. Just do it vocally and allow them to express what they're trying to drive. So similar to like kind of creating a song or VR reality that shows you what the future looks like if you achieve
yeah.
your OKR, or like a poem or something. Maybe that would be interesting. Like every OKR description is just a haiku, so people like know exactly like every OKR in your company is just a poem of what people's focus is. That could be interesting. So
It is
whatever fits sort of the culture of the organization, you can get kind of creative with that aspect of it. So
100%. And again, I'm really sad that Otter didn't stick around because I would be able to literally like take our conversation right now and turn it into a like a Lil Jon song or something if we wanted. Something
the
I've done.
next
That's one of my
EDM hit, yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. It's like one of my cheap tricks that I pull out during like client workshops. Um, okay, so any of these like really catching your eye as being like, I mean, these are interesting, but like really concrete ones that we would potentially recommend, or maybe variations.
um, I think all a lot of these are really looking at just very different ways to kind of express an OKR. And I think it's kind of like right now I'm working on a project with a client, more far more operational, but it's like how do we make sure people kind of get what we're trying to do, or at least
Yeah,
like train people or enable them? And it's like the more you can find ways that accommodate different learning styles or the communication styles, like the better it is for this. And I think if you're looking at running an OKRs program and building that energy, as we said, like finding the way that culturally adapts OKRs to that in interesting ways, like memes. Like you could have a meme for every OKR or something like that. I don't know. But I think that helps kind of the person who's running this program kind of understand, like, if you're running a process, it's a bit different than the sort of what we've been talking about, which is really about, you know, sort of the investment aspects of OKRs and AI, whereas now you can actually use AI to help build a more engaging behavioral process within your organization. So it's not as monotonous. It is a fun exercise. It is something people enjoy and get creative about. So um, I don't know about OKR therapy sessions. I think you and I probably need that ourselves. But uh,
yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, this is something we didn't even talk about, was the communication like after the fact and throughout. I think is a interesting thread, and really think of, yeah.
Graffiti wall would be really interesting. Graffiti wall sounds like a really interesting alignment map of like how
100%.
do all of the OKRs like kind of visually map together to create this art piece that is organized chaos. It's like that
Yeah.
that in itself, people see graffiti as chaos, others see it as art. I think that's kind of